The woman's hands did not shake. That was the first thing Xavier Crane noticed, that her hands were perfectly steady as she wrapped a loaf of bread in brown paper and handed it across the wooden counter to an old man with a bent spine. Her hands did not shake, even though the last time he had seen those hands, they had been pressed flat against his chest, pushing him away, telling him to go and never come back. Xavier pulled his horse to a dead stop in the middle of Redemption's Main Street, and the animal beneath him snorted and stamped, confused by the sudden halt. Dust rose in small curls around the horse's hooves. The afternoon sun hammered down on the backs of necks and the brims of hats alike, and the street hummed with the ordinary noise of an ordinary Wednesday in an ordinary Texas border town. None of it registered. None of it existed. Because Lena Roswell was standing 20 feet away from him, selling bread at a corner stall, and she was supposed to be dead. He had been told she was dead. He had been shown a grave. He had stood at that grave in the pouring rain 3 years ago in a cemetery outside of San Antonio, and pressed his fingers into the mud and wept in a way he had not wept since he was a boy. And then he had put himself back together and ridden away and become the hollow, solitary thing that he was now. And she was not dead. She was wearing a simple cotton dress the color of straw, and her dark hair was pinned up at the back of her head in a way that let loose strands fall against her neck. And she was laughing at something the bent old man had said, and the laugh was exactly the same. Exactly the same as it had been 3 years ago when she used to laugh at things he said, and the sound of it used to make him feel like the world was a reasonable place to live in. Xavier Crane did not move. He sat on his horse like a man who had been struck by lightning and was still processing the voltage. She looked up. The moment stretched. He watched the recognition hit her face the way a stone hits still water, first the impact, then the ripples moving outward. Her hand froze, still resting on the counter. The laughter died completely. The color drained from her face so rapidly that he could actually see it happening, and then something else moved across her expression. Something he could not immediately name, fear. She was afraid of him. Xavier Crane had ridden into more than 60 dangerous situations in 12 years of ranging, and he had never once turned around and ridden back out. But in that moment, looking at the fear on Lena Roswell's face, the face of the woman he had believed to be dead, the woman he had loved more completely than he had ever loved anything, he wanted to turn his horse around and vanish back into the desert and never speak of what he had seen. He did not. He dismounted, looped his reins over a hitching post and walked toward her. He needed to understand what had happened. He needed to understand everything. Millwood Crossing was not a large town. It had a general store, a livery stable, a doctor's office that also served as a dentist's office when the need arose, a saloon called the Painted Bird, a church of modest ambitions, and a post office. It had a school that operated 3 days a week, because the teacher also worked the other 2 days at the general store to make ends meet. It had a bakery. The bakery was called simply Roswell's, because Martha Roswell, who was Lena's mother, had never seen a reason to give a business a name that was anything other than the name of the person running it. Martha was a wide woman with strong arms and a practical, unromantic relationship with the world, and she made bread and pies and occasionally cakes for weddings, and she was very good at all of these things. Lena helped her mother in the bakery every morning from 4 o'clock until noon, when the morning's work was done and the bread was sold and the pies were cooling. And then she spent her afternoons doing the accounts for the general store, because she was unusually good with numbers and Harold Fitch, who owned the general store, was unusually bad with them. Xavier noticed the bakery on his first morning in Millwood Crossing, because the smell of fresh bread was the first smell he encountered when he woke up, and it reminded him powerfully and unexpectedly of his grandmother's house in Virginia, when he was a young child, before the war had rearranged the landscape of his family's life so completely that nothing recognizable remained. He went inside to buy something for breakfast, and Lena was behind the counter, writing figures in a small ledger, and she did not look up immediately when he came in, which he found disarming because most people looked up at a Texas Ranger when he walked through a door. It was the badge and the gun belt and the general atmosphere of officiousness that tended to command attention. She finished her figure, set down her pencil, and looked up. "Morning," she said. "What can I get you?" Her eyes were the color of strong coffee, dark and warm, and she looked at him with a kind of direct, uncomplicated assessment that he was completely unused to receiving from anyone, let alone a young woman behind a bakery counter. "What would you recommend?" he asked, which was not a thing he typically said. He was not a man who asked for recommendations. He usually knew what he wanted. "The sourdough is exceptional today," she said. "My mother has been working on that recipe for 6 months and she finally got it right. The cornbread is reliable. The apple pie is better than anything else in town, but it might be too much for breakfast." "I'll take the sourdough," he said, "and a slice of the pie. For breakfast. I've been riding since yesterday evening. My sense of appropriate timing is somewhat disrupted." She smiled at that, a small, honest smile, and cut him a slice of pie and wrapped half a loaf of the sourdough in paper and handed them across the counter to him. He paid her, and he ate the pie right there at the counter because there was nowhere else to sit, and it was in fact better than anything else in town. He told her so. "Tell my mother," she said. "She'll appreciate it more than I will. I've been tasting this pie in various stages of development for months, and I've lost all objectivity about it." He found himself smiling. "Xavier Crane," he said, and held out his hand across the counter. She looked at his hand for a moment with a slightly amused expression, as if the formality was unexpected, and then shook it. "Lena Roswell." He ate breakfast at the bakery every morning for the 6 weeks he was in Millwood Crossing working the cattle theft case. He told himself at first that it was the quality of the food, and then he told himself it was the convenience of the location relative to the place he was boarding. And then he stopped telling himself anything at all and simply accepted that he went to the bakery every morning because Lena Roswell was there, and that Lena Roswell being there was reason enough. They talked every morning while he ate. They talked about small things at first: the weather, the news that arrived on the weekly stage from San Antonio, the state of the cattle ranges, the drought that had been troubling the southern part of the territory for 2 years. He solved the cattle theft case in the 4th week. A man named Corbin Latch had been running stolen cattle across the river into Mexico with the help of 2 cousins and a disgruntled former ranch hand who knew the southern range well enough to move cattle through it in darkness without losing any. Xavier arrested Corbin Latch and the former ranch hand and sent word to the Mexican authorities about the cousins, and the district captain wrote him a letter of commendation, and technically, his work in Millwood Crossing was complete. He asked the captain for 2 more weeks on the grounds that there were unresolved local tensions that might produce further incidents if not monitored. The captain, who had known Xavier for 12 years and had developed a sophisticated appreciation for his judgment, agreed. Xavier spent one of those 2 additional weeks doing very little in the way of ranging activity. He spent a great deal of that week sitting at the bakery counter, or walking with Lena along the river in the late afternoons when her work was done, talking, just talking. He had not talked this much to any single person in years. He had not wanted to. On the last day of his extended stay, he asked her if he could write to her. She was quiet for a moment, and he could not read her expression, which was unusual because he was generally good at reading expressions. "Where would you write from?" she asked. "Wherever I am," he said, "which changes, but letters reach me through the district office in San Antonio." "I'd like that," she said finally. "I'd like that very much." He wrote to her from 6 different towns over the following 8 months. She wrote back from the same address, which was the bakery, and her letters were exactly the way she was in person, direct and thoughtful and funny in a dry, observational way that crept up on you. He read her letters more than once. He did not tell her this. "You could stop riding away," she said, which was characteristically direct. "I could," he agreed. "I'm not entirely sure I know how to do that. I imagine it would involve staying in one place. I imagine it would." They looked at each other in the gray winter light by the muddy river, and then he kissed her for the first time, and it was careful and certain, and it felt like arriving somewhere he had not realized he was trying to get to. He went on to his assignment in the West, because he could not simply abandon his obligations, but he came back in the spring, and this time he stayed for 3 weeks, and this time there was no pretense about passing through. He was there because Lena Roswell was there, and they both knew it, and her mother Martha watched him at dinner one evening with narrowed, assessing eyes and then said, "You're a good man, I think, but you're restless," and he did not know how to argue with either part of that assessment. Martha Roswell's health declined noticeably that spring. The weakness in her lungs had deepened into something the doctor called consumption, and he said it with the careful, regretful face that doctors use when they are telling you something is going in only one direction. Lena did not collapse under this information. She absorbed it and reorganized around it the way she did with difficult things, practically and without self-pity. And she expanded her hours at the bakery and reduced her hours at the general store to compensate for the work her mother could no longer do. And she made sure Martha's room was warm and that she rested, and that she ate. And she did all of this while continuing to be, as far as Xavier could observe, fundamentally herself. He stayed in Millwood Crossing for the whole summer of 1879, working a loose arrangement with his district captain that allowed him to take assignments within a reasonable riding radius of the town and return between them. The captain, who had previously suggested Xavier should think about settling somewhere, was unexpectedly accommodating about this arrangement. He was sitting on Lena's porch on a hot August evening when she came out and sat beside him and was quiet for a long time, looking at the street, and then she said, "I think I'm in love with you." He turned to look at her. "I think I have been for a while," she continued, with the slightly careful tone of someone reporting an accurate finding. "I wanted to tell you because I think it's important to be honest about things like that." He reached over and took her hand and held it and said, "I know I'm in love with you. I've known it for months. I've been trying to figure out how to say it without making a fool of myself." She looked at him with a small, warm smile. "You could have just said what I said. You're braver than I am." "In some ways," she agreed. Martha Roswell died in November of 1879. She had a bad night in the middle of the month and did not recover from it. And she died quietly in her own bed with Lena beside her, holding her hand. Xavier sat in the kitchen all that night, because Lena had asked him to be in the house. And in the morning, when it was over, he made coffee and they sat together in the kitchen. And Lena cried in a quiet, exhausted way that broke his heart as cleanly as anything had ever broken it. He had not planned to propose. He had thought about it. He was not a man who did things without thinking about them. But he had not yet arrived at a plan at a specific moment, at the proper arrangement of words. But sitting in that kitchen in the gray November morning with Martha gone and Lena's red eyes and her cold hands wrapped around a coffee cup, he understood suddenly that he did not want to be anywhere else in the world, that this was the place and the person, that there was nothing to plan because the answer was already clear. "Marry me," he said. She looked up from her coffee cup. "I know the timing is terrible," he said. "I know this morning is terrible, and I know my situation is complicated, and I know I've been asking you to wait for me to figure out how to stop riding away. But I love you and I do not want to be anywhere except wherever you are. So marry me." She was quiet for a long moment, and he waited. "Yes," she said, not dramatically, just yes in her direct, certain way. Yes, they were engaged for 4 months. They planned a small wedding for the following March. Nothing elaborate, because neither of them was interested in elaborateness. And Lena continued running the bakery, and Xavier continued ranging, now with an even stronger argument for staying within riding distance of Millwood Crossing. And then February arrived, and with it arrived a man named Edmund Farrow. Edmund Farrow was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, well-dressed for the frontier, and enormously charming in the specific, dangerous way of men who have spent years perfecting the art of making people trust them. He arrived in Millwood Crossing with 2 business associates, a leather valise full of documents, and a proposition for several local landowners that involved a planned railroad spur and land value and investment opportunities that he described with the confident, detailed fluency of a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. He came into the bakery on his second morning in town because everyone came into the bakery eventually. Xavier was not there that morning. He was 3 days' ride away, dealing with a dispute on the eastern range that his captain had called him to address urgently. Lena wrote to Xavier about Edmund Farrow in a letter that reached him a week later. She described him as smooth and possibly dishonest, and said that Harold Fitch at the general store was very excited about the railroad investment, and she wished Harold would be more cautious. She said she had told Harold to be more cautious, but that Harold was not a cautious man. Xavier wrote back immediately, telling her that railroad investment schemes were extremely common in the territory, and that many of them were fraudulent, and that she should warn Harold in stronger terms. He did not feel particularly worried about it. He trusted Lena's judgment. He expected to be back within another 10 days. He was not back within another 10 days. The dispute on the eastern range escalated into something more serious, involving a dead ranch hand and accusations of claim jumping, and his captain directed him to stay and see it through. He sent Lena a letter explaining this. He did not hear back from her. He sent another letter a week later. Silence. He told himself that the mail was unreliable, which it was. He told himself that she was busy, which she always was. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation and that he should not assume the worst, which was his instinct. He finished the claim-jumping investigation and rode back toward Millwood Crossing in early March, and he was still 2 days out when a rider going the other direction recognized his badge and stopped him on the road to deliver the kind of news that riders going the opposite direction sometimes carry. There had been a fire at Roswell's bakery. The woman who ran it, young woman, dark hair, the baker's daughter, had not gotten out. Xavier Crane sat on his horse on the road and listened to the rider say these things and felt the world rearrange itself around him into a configuration that did not contain Lena Roswell, and he could not process that configuration at all. He rode to Millwood Crossing anyway, because he had to. He had to see it with his own eyes. The bakery was a charred ruin. The town had tried to save it, but the fire had moved quickly, they said. It had started in the night. No one quite understood how. Harold Fitch, who was grieving and red-eyed and visibly destroyed by guilt, told him that Edmund Farrow and his associates had left town 5 days before the fire. taking with them several signed investment documents and a not insignificant amount of money from half a dozen Millwood Crossing residents. Harold had been among them. The local sheriff, a man named Garrett who was competent but overworked, said he was investigating but that Farrow and his men had a 5-day head start and the trail was cold. There was a grave in the cemetery on the eastern edge of town. The stone was simple because there was no family left to arrange anything more. Lena Roswell, 1858-1880. Xavier stood at that grave for a long time in the rain. He pressed his fingers into the mud at its base. He said things he would not repeat to anyone. Then he rode away, because he could not stay there, and because there was nothing left for him in Millwood Crossing. For 2 years after that, he was the kind of ranger who volunteers for the most difficult and dangerous assignments, not from courage but from the logic that a man who has nothing to lose can be put in harm's way without much moral cost to the men making the assignments. His captain noticed this and said things to him about it periodically, gentle things, because the captain was not an unfeeling man, and Xavier listened to these things and nodded and continued being exactly as he was. He rode. He worked cases. He went from town to town across the wide, burning landscape of South Texas, and he slept badly and ate poorly and spoke only when necessary. And after a while even the men who had known him before said, quietly among themselves, that Crane was different now. Harder. Like something that had been tempered by heat and lost whatever softness it once had. This was the Xavier Crane who rode into Redemption, Texas, in the late afternoon of October the 8th, 1882, on his way to another assignment involving another crime in another town, simply passing through. Simply stopping for the night. He had not expected to freeze in the middle of the main street. He had not expected to see a dead woman selling bread. He walked across the street toward her, and she watched him come with those steady hands and that afraid face, and when he was close enough to speak at normal volume, he stopped. "Lena," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw tightened. Her chin came up slightly, that particular gesture he remembered from arguments they had not quite had but nearly had when she was preparing to say something difficult. "Xavier," she said. "There is a grave," he said, "with your name on it, I know. The town of Millwood Crossing believes you are dead. I know that too." He looked at her for a long time, searching her face for something, an explanation, a beginning of anything. He felt all at once the weight of 2.5 years of grief sitting behind his sternum like a stone, and alongside it a new feeling that he did not have a ready name for, something with teeth. "I need you to tell me what happened," he said. She looked left and right along the street, a quick, involuntary movement the kind a person makes when they are checking for something specific. "Not here," she said. "Please, not here." "Where?" "I close up at 6. There is a small house at the north end of town, near the water tower. It has a blue door." She paused. "Will you come?" He looked at her for another moment. "Yes," he said. He spent the hours between 5 in the afternoon and 6 o'clock doing very little of any practical value. He stabled his horse at the town livery, checked into the single boarding house that Redemption offered, sat on the edge of the boarding house bed, and thought. She was alive. She had let him believe she was dead for 2.5 years. There was a reason for this, presumably, because Lena Roswell did not do things without reasons. But what reason was sufficient? What reason could possibly be sufficient for that? He went through possibilities methodically, as he did with everything, because methodical thinking was the thing that had kept him functional when nothing else could. She had run away from something or someone. The fire had been deliberate. Edmund Farrow was the most obvious connection. At 5 minutes past 6, He walked north along Redemption's main street until he found the house with the blue door. He knocked. She opened the door almost immediately, which meant she had been standing close to it, waiting. She stepped back to let him in. The house was small, a main room with a table and 2 chairs and a cast iron stove, a doorway to what was presumably a bedroom, a shelf of books along one wall. It was clean and spare. A loaf of bread sat cooling on the counter, because of course it did. She sat in one of the chairs. He sat in the other. The table between them was very narrow, and the oil lamp on it cast a warm, unsteady light that made shadows move. "Tell me everything," he said. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them for a moment and then looked up at him. "Edmund Farrow," she said. "I thought so." "He was not only running an investment scheme," she said. "The railroad documents were real or real enough. There were genuine investors, a genuine proposition, though the terms he was representing were fraudulent. But the deeper part of what he was doing involved land grants. Forged land grants primarily in this region, along the river between here and the Rio Grande." Xavier watched her. "Explain." "There are several very large pieces of land in this territory that have unclear legal status," she said. "Old Spanish land grants, some of them, the kind that the courts have been arguing about for decades. Farrow had a man in the land office in Austin, someone who could create documents that appeared legitimate. He was selling these parcels to investors who thought they were buying clear title to land. They were not. The land wasn't his to sell." "And how did you know about this?" She took a breath. "He left a document in the bakery. He came in on his 3rd day in Millwood Crossing, and he was looking at a map with one of his associates, and when they left, one of the documents stayed behind. I think it fell under the counter. I found it the next morning when I was cleaning." "What kind of document?" "A letter. Between Farrow and the man in the Austin land office, describing the scheme specifically, naming the parcels, naming amounts, clear evidence." "You should have given it to the sheriff," Xavier said, and then stopped himself, because he could hear how that sounded, how easy it was to say. "I went to the sheriff," she said flatly. "Garrett. I showed him the letter. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at me and he said he would look into it, and I went home. That evening a man I had never seen before came to the bakery after dark and told me that if I valued my life, I would return the document and keep my mouth shut. He was very specific about what would happen if I did not." "The fire," Xavier said. "The fire was 3 days later." "I had not given back the document. I had hidden it." She paused. "I saw them set it. 2 men the middle of the night. I saw them from my bedroom window. I had not been sleeping well. You got out. There is a door at the back of the bakery that leads to the alley. I was out before the fire took the main room." She stopped for a moment, and for the first time something cracked slightly in her composure. "I had maybe 10 minutes to decide what to do. I was standing in the alley with the document in my hand and the bakery burning behind me, and I thought, if I survive this officially, if Xavier Crane's fiancée survives this fire, they will try again. They will keep trying. They are organized, they have money, they have someone in the state land office. I cannot go to the sheriff because the sheriff did nothing, and I cannot put Xavier in the way of this." The last sentence landed between them very quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "So you died," he said. "I found a woman who had died the night before, a traveler, passing through, no family in the area, no one who knew her. She was in the doctor's office. I told the doctor the woman was me." She looked at him steadily. "The doctor helped me. He was a good man. He understood what I was telling him about the danger. He agreed that the death certificate would bear my name. And then you came here. I came to several places first. I moved around for months. I eventually came here because I knew a woman in Redemption. A friend of my mother's from years ago, and she helped me get established. I've been here a year and a half." "Still selling bread," he said, and there was something in his voice that he could not quite control, something that was not anger but was adjacent to it. "It's what I know how to do," she said simply. He stood up abruptly and walked to the far side of the small room, which was not far, and stood with his back to her for a moment, both hands on the shelf of books. He could feel everything inside him in a way he was not accustomed to and did not know how to manage. "You let me grieve you," he said, "for 2.5 years. "Yes," she said, and her voice was very quiet. I know what I did." He turned around. "I stood at a grave with your name on it and he stopped." "I know," she said again. There were tears in her eyes now, the first he had seen. She was not letting them fall, which was completely like her. "There was not a day I did not think about it, not a single day. But I did not know how to. If I had written to you, if I had found a way to tell you where I was, you would have come. You would have come directly." "Yes," he said, "and they would have killed you. Or I would have been found and we both would have been killed. And I could not." She stopped and collected herself. "I could not live with having caused your death, whereas I could, apparently, live with the alternative, even though it was terrible, even though there was not a day that was not terrible." He looked at her across the small room for a long time. "Do you still have the document?" he said. She blinked. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not that. "Yes," she said slowly, "I have it." "Where?" She went to the bookshelf and took down a worn copy of a book about natural history and opened it to the back pages, where a folded piece of paper had been pressed flat. She held it out to him. He crossed the room and took it. He unfolded it and read it carefully. It was exactly what she had described: clear, specific, incriminating evidence. Names, figures, parcel descriptions. A record of a complex fraud that had been running for at least 3 years, given the dates in the letter. "This is extraordinary," he said. "I know. This could bring down a considerable operation if given to the right people. I know that too. That's why I never destroyed it, even when I thought about it." She paused. "I did think about it, several times." He folded it carefully and held onto it and looked at her. The lamp between them moved in a small draft. The room was very quiet. Outside, Redemption's evening sounds, horses, voices, the distant sound of a piano from somewhere filtered through the walls. "I need to send word to my captain," he said. "And there is someone in Austin, a prosecutor named Hennessy, who has been building a case against land fraud in this territory for 2 years. This document could be exactly what he needs. And Pharaoh, we will find him." He paused. "He has been doing this for 3 years. He won't stop. There will be a trail." She nodded slowly. She was watching him with a careful expression. "Xavier, are you all right?" He laughed, very briefly and not particularly happily. "No," he said. "I'm not all right. I have spent 2.5 years believing you were dead. I don't know how to be all right about that in an evening." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. I am genuinely, deeply sorry." "I believe you," he said, and he did believe her. He understood the logic of what she had done. He could see the impossible position she had been in, standing in that alley with the bakery burning, with no sheriff she could trust, and a man she loved in danger, and a piece of paper in her hand that was both a weapon and a target. He understood all of it logically. It did not make it hurt less. "I need some time," he said. I need some time." "Of course," she said. He folded the document into his breast pocket next to his heart, which struck him as either deeply ironic or deeply appropriate. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the door frame and looked back at her. She was sitting very still in the lamplight with her hands in her lap and her red eyes that she would not cry from and her steady, careful composure. And she looked exactly like herself. exactly like the woman he had been in love with and grieved for, and tried to stop being in love with because she was dead, and he had believed it necessary to eventually stop being in love with dead people. "I'm glad you're alive," he said. He went out into the redemption night. He did not sleep. He sat in the boarding house room and wrote a long letter to his district captain, laying out everything Lena had told him and describing the document in detail, requesting contact with Prosecutor Hennessy in Austin as a matter of urgency. He addressed it to the captain's office and asked the boarding house owner if there was a rider going to San Antonio in the morning. There was. He paid the man to carry the letter. Then he sat with the document itself, reading it again and again by candlelight, letting the specificity of it settle into his understanding. The names were specific. The parcels were described with legal precision. The amounts were substantial. This was not a small operation, and Edmund Farrow was not a careless man. But careless men did not drop documents, and careless men did not run schemes that lasted 3 years and crossed multiple counties. And Farrow had nonetheless lost this piece of paper in a bakery in Millwood Crossing, which suggested that even very careful men sometimes made small errors, and that small errors in large schemes tended to eventually destroy the schemes. He thought about Lena Roswell standing in an alley behind a burning building, making a decision in 10 minutes. In the morning, he went back to the stall on the corner where she sold bread. She looked up when she saw him coming and lifted her chin slightly, that gesture again, bracing for something. "Can I help?" he asked. "With the stall," she blinked. "I don't what, while I'm here, while I wait for a response from my captain. Can I help with the stall?" She stared at him for a moment. "You want to help me sell bread?" "I want to be near you," he said, which was the honest answer. "And I cannot simply sit in the boarding house for however many days this takes. I am not a man built for inactivity, and the stall needs—" he looked at it critically. "The left support post needs reinforcing." She looked at the left support post, which had a slight lean to it. "I've been meaning to fix that." "I can fix it." She looked at him. "All right," she said, "if you want to." He fixed the post that morning, and he helped her carry the bread from her house to the stall. And when customers came, he stood back and let her run the transactions, because she knew the prices and the customers and he did not. And between customers they talked. At first they talked about the case, about what Hennessy's prosecution might look like, about how Farrow operated and where he might be now, about the practical steps of transforming a hidden document into a court proceeding. Xavier knew how these things worked, and Lena was a quick study and asked precise, useful questions. But after an hour or so of this, they drifted, as they always had, onto other topics. He told her about a case from the previous year that had taken him to a small town on the Brazos River, where every man in the town was named James, or some variant of it, and the confusion this had generated in the course of his investigation. She laughed. The real laugh, the one he had heard from across the street when he first saw her, the one that was exactly the same. He felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched for 2.5 years. He helped her every day after that. Every morning he carried the bread to the stall, and every afternoon he walked her home after she closed up. And they talked, and it was both familiar and tentative, like two people who had been fluent in a language and were now reacquiring it after a long absence. He did not press her. He did not make declarations. He was not sure yet where he stood in relation to everything that had happened, what he felt versus what he could trust, what was love and what was grief rearranging itself into something new and complicated. He gave himself, and both of them, time. On the 4th day, the woman whose friend of her mother's she had sheltered with came by the stall, a Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, a widow of perhaps 55 with a sharp eye and a generous mouth, and she looked at Xavier with transparent curiosity and then looked at Lena with a very specific expression. "Is this him?" Mrs. Whitmore said. Lena's color rose. "Agnes, is it the ranger you told me about?" "Agnes, please." "It is," Xavier said because he liked the directness. "I gather she told you about me." "Told me about you," Mrs. Whitmore repeated in a tone that implied this was something of an understatement. "Well, you're taller than I imagined." She looked him over without apology. "You seem like a decent man. I hope you are. She has had enough trouble." "Agnes," Lena said, mortified. "She has," Mrs. Whitmore said firmly, and then patted Lena's arm and walked away. After she left, Xavier looked at Lena, who was staring at the street with significant determination. "You told her about me," he said. "I was not under an obligation to keep silent about everything," she said with dignity. He smiled. He could not help it. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that I had been engaged," she said, "and that ending that engagement had cost me considerably." He looked at her for a long moment. "Me too," he said. The response from his captain came 6 days after he sent his letter. The captain wrote that he had forwarded Xavier's summary to Prosecutor Hennessy in Austin, and that Hennessy had responded with urgency. Hennessy had been building a case against fraudulent land grants in the territory for 18 months and had identified Farrow as a central figure, but had been unable to find direct documentary evidence connecting Farrow to the fraud. The letter Xavier had described, if it was what it appeared to be, was potentially the cornerstone of Hennessy's case. Hennessy would send a man to meet Xavier in Redemption within a fortnight. Xavier showed Lena the letter at the stall that afternoon. She read it carefully and then folded it and handed it back and was quiet for a moment. "Once Hennessy has the document," she said, "what happens? He builds his case. He arrests Farrow and the man in the land office and whoever else is implicated. He prosecutes. And me. Do I have to?" She stopped. "I am officially dead. Lena Roswell is buried in Millwood Crossing. I have been living here under a different name." He had not fully thought this through. He thought it through now, quickly. "What name are you using?" "Lena Rhodes," she said. "It's close enough to my real name that I don't forget to respond to it." "Hennessy may need you to testify," he said. "Not necessarily in court, a deposition might be enough, but he will need to know how the document was found and where it has been." She looked at the street. "And then what happens to the grave in Millwood Crossing?" "I suppose it becomes a complicated question," he said, "about which Lena Roswell exists." She looked at him. "I spent 2.5 years as a dead woman. I do not particularly want to spend the rest of my life as one." "No," he agreed. "You should not have to." "Is there a legal process for—" She paused. "For undying?" He looked at her, and despite everything, despite the complexity of the situation and the weight of the past 2.5 years, something flickered at the corner of his mouth. "I imagine Hennessy will know." She saw the flicker and something shifted in her own expression, something warming. "You're finding this amusing, only slightly." "It's a very small amount of amusement for a very large problem." "It is," he agreed, "but you are alive. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Whatever the complications, you are alive. And I am finding that more significant than any of the complications." She looked at him for a long moment across the narrow counter of the bread stall, with the afternoon sun on both of them, and the sounds of redemption moving around them. "I missed you every day," she said quietly. "I need you to know that. I need you to know that none of it was easy and none of it was without cost to me." "I know," he said. "I could see it, the day I rode in. Even through the shock of seeing you, I could see that you had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. You looked so—" She stopped. "You looked different. You looked like someone had taken some essential thing out of you and not put it back." "They had," he said simply. She looked down at her hands, those steady hands, and for a moment the steadiness wobbled. "I'm sorry," she said. "I am so sorry, Xavier." He reached across the counter and put his hand over hers. She looked up. "I know," he said. "I understand why you did it. I believe it was the only option you saw, and I believe you were probably right that it was the safest option. I am not going to spend the rest of my life being angry about it." He paused. "I was angry for a few days. You had every right to be." "I was angry and also overwhelmingly grateful," he said. "Those two things at the same time are somewhat difficult to navigate." She turned her hand over beneath his and held it. Her fingers were strong and warm, bakery calloused and familiar. "What happens now?" she asked. "Hennessy's man comes. We give him the document. We figure out the legal situation with your official status. And then," he looked at her, "then we decide what we want." "What do you want?" she asked, direct as always. He looked at her for a long time. At the dark eyes, and the loose strands of hair at her neck, and the strong hands and the slight wariness that 2.5 years of being a dead woman had put into her expression alongside everything that was fundamentally and irreducibly herself. "The same thing I wanted 3 years ago," he said. Hennessy's man arrived 12 days later. His name was Victor Salas, a young deputy marshal from Austin who was organized and serious and treated the whole affair with a brisk efficiency that Xavier appreciated. He took the document, examined it with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at, and then took a full statement from Lena about how she had found it, where it had been since, and the circumstances surrounding the fire in Millwood Crossing. Lena gave her statement in Mrs. Whitmore's sitting room, because Mrs. Whitmore had insisted that the meeting needed to happen somewhere dignified and comfortable, and had provided the sitting room along with a pot of coffee and what were frankly excellent cookies. Salas ate 3 of the cookies and asked careful, precise questions, and Lena answered them clearly and completely. When it was over, Salas asked about the question of her official status with the straightforward pragmatism of a man who had presumably encountered stranger legal situations in the course of his work. "Prosecutor Hennessy will handle it," he said. "There will be paperwork. It will take some time. But these things can be resolved, Mrs." He paused, consulting his notes. "Miss Roswell, excuse me, Miss Rhodes, whatever name you prefer." "Roswell," she said firmly. "My name is Lena Roswell. It always was." He left the following morning with the document and her statement, and Xavier walked him to the livery and shook his hand and watched him ride out of Redemption toward Austin, carrying with him the evidence that had been hidden in a book about natural history for 2.5 years. He walked back through town to Mrs. Whitmore's house, where Lena was still sitting in the parlor, and he knocked, and Mrs. Whitmore let him in with a knowing look and made herself scarce with an ease that suggested she had planned to do exactly this. Lena was standing by the window. She turned when he came in. "It's done," he said. "Salas has everything." She nodded. She had a particular expression on her face, slightly transparent, the look of someone experiencing the release of a very long tension and not quite sure what to do with the space it leaves behind. "When Hennessy arrests Farrow," she said, "when this is public, you will be safe," he said. "The document is out of your hands. You are no longer the only person who knows about it. You will not be the target anymore." She nodded again. She turned back to the window for a moment and looked at the street, and then she said, "I have been frightened for 2.5 years. Not always acute fear, mostly a low, constant wariness, looking over my shoulder, avoiding anything that might draw attention. Selling bread because it is the one thing I know how to do that does not require papers or history or explanation, just flour and water and time." "You're extraordinarily good at it," he said. "The bread." She turned back from the window and looked at him. Xavier. Yes. I need to know if we are. She stopped, searched for the words, tried again. I do not want to assume that because you said 3 years ago that you wanted the same thing, that this is still. I mean to say that a great deal has happened, and I understand if what you feel now is different from Lena, he said. She stopped. I am still in love with you, he said. Completely. Whatever happened, whatever time passed, whatever I did or thought or tried in the interim to make myself into a person who was not in love with you, it didn't work. Finding you alive in this town was the most significant moment of my life, including the moment you agreed to marry me, which was previously at the top of the list. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around him and pressed her face against his chest, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that for a long time in Mrs. Whitmore's sunny parlor, not speaking. After a while she said into the fabric of his shirt, I love you. I never stopped. I thought about you every day. The whole time I was selling bread to strangers I thought about you. He pressed his face into her hair. He breathed. He felt the stone that had sat behind his sternum for 2.5 years dissolve, very slowly, like sugar in warm water. I know, he said. Hennessy's case moved faster than Xavier had expected, which he attributed to the quality of the document, and the 18 months of groundwork the prosecutor had already laid. Within 3 weeks of Sala's leaving redemption, word came back through official channels that Edmund Farrow had been arrested in Lerdo while preparing to board a ferry across the Rio Grande. The man in the Austin land office, whose name turned out to be a Mr. Gerald Holt, had been taken into custody the same day, along with 2 of Farrow's associates. The letter Hennessy sent Xavier with this information was brisk and professional, but contained a paragraph near the end that was notably warmer in tone, in which Hennessy stated that the document recovered by Miss Roswell had proved to be exactly the instrument needed to close the case, and that her courage in preserving it through extraordinarily difficult circumstances had been instrumental in bringing a substantial fraud to justice. He said that no fewer than 12 families who had been defrauded of money and land would have the opportunity to recover their losses through the courts as a result. Xavier, read this paragraph to Lena at the bread stall that afternoon. She listened with her arms crossed and a careful expression, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, Good. Simply that, good. He folded the letter. Hennessy also addresses the question of your status, he said. He says the documentation is straightforward from a legal standpoint. Proof of identity, a corrective record submitted to the Vital Statistics Office, a deposition explaining the circumstances. He paused. He also says that he is aware that the situation in Millwood Crossing involved the official indifference of the local sheriff, and that the county is investigating whether that indifference was active or passive, whether Garrett was complicit with Farrow or simply inadequate. I thought about that, she said. I was not certain which it was when I went to him. He might have simply been frightened. Men who are frightened into inaction when someone brings them evidence of a crime are perhaps not suited to the office of sheriff, Xavier said. No, she agreed. Probably not. The legal process of restoring Lena Roswell to official existence took 3 months, managed through an Austin attorney that Hennessy recommended. There was paperwork, as Salas had predicted, and a formal deposition, and a corrected death record in San Antonio County, and the attorney managed all of it with competent efficiency. Lena paid the attorney's fees from her savings, which she had managed carefully over 2.5 years of selling bread. During those 3 months, Xavier's situation required some negotiation with his captain. He explained, in terms he had never quite used with his captain before, that he had found a reason to stop moving. The captain, who had been waiting for this news for approximately 3 years, and who had been privately of the opinion that Xavier Crane's best years as a ranger were being consumed by a grief that no man should carry alone, responded with what could only be described as relief. He offered Xavier a position as a district officer, based in the Redemption area, which would involve supervisory and investigative work without the constant travel of a field ranger. Xavier accepted. He told Lena about the position one afternoon when he came to help close up the stall, and she looked at him with a careful, searching expression. "You're staying," she said. "I'm staying," he said. Something moved across her face that he recognized as the controlled version of something much larger. She nodded, twice, in a way that was slightly too deliberate to be casual. "Good," she said, which was her word for things that mattered very much to her and that she was not ready to say more about. He proposed to her again that evening, on the porch of her small house with the blue door, in the cool October air that was very much like the cool air of the October when they had first arrived in this situation, as if the intervening 2.5 years were a long parenthetical in a sentence that was now resuming its original direction. He did it properly this time, with forethought and planning, though the words when they came were not particularly planned, because they never were with her. He told her that he had loved her for 3 years through all of their circumstances, including the ones that had tried very hard to make love impossible, and that he intended to go on loving her, and that he would very much like to do this as her husband. She said yes. She said it the same way she had the first time, not dramatically, just yes, certain and direct. Then she put her hand against his cheek and kissed him, and the kiss was not at all like the first one 3 years ago. It was warmer and fuller, and carried 3 years of everything in it. Grief and fear and relief and love that had survived being tested in ways that would have destroyed lesser material. They married in March of 1883, in Redemption's church, which had more modest ambitions than Millwood Crossings but was clean and well-maintained and smelled of pine and candle wax. Mrs. Whitmore was there, of course, in an excellent hat. Victor Salas rode out from Austin, which Xavier had not expected and was genuinely moved by. Xavier's captain attended with his wife, a woman who cried at weddings with complete unself-consciousness, and who told Lena at the reception afterward that she had been hoping Xavier would find his way to this for years. The ceremony was small. The minister was young and earnest and fumbled his notes once and recovered well. Xavier held Lena's hands and said the words, and Lena held his hands and said the words back, and she did not shake. Of course, she did not shake. Her hands were steady as they always were. They moved into a house on the north side of Redemption, a proper house, larger than the small house with the blue door, which Lena gave up with some regret, because she had made it genuinely comfortable over 1.5 years of residence, and she had a proprietary feeling about the blue door. Xavier painted the door of the new house blue, which she pretended not to find as meaningful as she clearly did. She continued selling bread, because she was not a woman who stopped doing things simply because her circumstances changed. She expanded, over the following year, from the corner stall to a small dedicated space on the main street. Not quite a full bakery, because Redemption was not quite large enough for that, but a proper counter with a back room for baking. And she hired a young woman named Cora Henderson to help her in the mornings, so that she was no longer doing all the work alone. Cora was energetic and willing, and had an extraordinary natural instinct for pastry that Lena cultivated with the same methodical, practical approach she brought to everything. Xavier settled into his district officer role with the focused energy of a man who has found a sustainable mode of operation. He investigated, he supervised, he wrote reports and corresponded with county officials, and occasionally still rode out into the field when a situation required it. Though now, when he rode out, he also rode back reliably. And Lena knew when to expect him, and he came home within the expected time frame, or sent word explaining his delay. The reliability of this, after the years of irregular correspondence and long absences, was something neither of them took for granted. In the summer of 1884, Edmund Farrow was convicted in an Austin courtroom on 12 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy in connection with the fire in Millwood Crossing. Lena's deposition, delivered in written form because Hennessy determined she did not need to appear in court in person, was read into the record. Farrow received a substantial prison sentence. Mr. Gerald Holt received a lesser sentence as part of a cooperation arrangement, but lost his position in the land office and his reputation with it, which Xavier thought was perhaps the punishment that cut deepest for a man of Holt's type. The man in the Austin land office was not the only official whose conduct became a matter of investigation. Sheriff Garrett of Millwood Crossing was reviewed by the county, and it was determined that his failure to act on Lena's evidence had been a result of what the review delicately called a conflict of interests. Garrett had received a modest amount of money from Farrow's associates, not enough to suggest deep conspiracy, but enough to explain his inaction. He resigned before the county could formally remove him. Xavier was not satisfied by this outcome and said so in a letter to his captain, and the captain agreed, and the county was made to understand that the matter was being watched at the district level. Neither of these facts brought back the 2.5 years. Xavier had largely stopped expecting things to be fair in a cosmic sense, but the justice that was available was better than nothing, and he chose to focus on what had been resolved rather than what could not be. The 12 families who had been defrauded in Farrow's land scheme began the process of recovering their losses through civil proceedings, which would take years. The law in 1884 did not move quickly in any direction, but which were moving in the right direction. In the autumn of 1884, Lena told Xavier one evening, very calmly, as she was setting dinner on the table, that she was pregnant. He looked at her. "I thought you should know," she said, with the slight, dry humor of someone reporting an accurate finding. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her with a thoroughness that caused the dinner to get cold before they sat down to eat it, and they did not particularly mind. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas, which had been Xavier's grandfather's name and which Lena said was solid and reliable, qualities she approved of. Thomas Crane arrived in June of 1885 with considerable noise and a remarkable amount of dark hair that Lena said he had gotten from her side, and Xavier said he had gotten from both sides, since his own hair was dark. Thomas was generally healthy and generally loud, and had from very early the direct brown-eyed gaze of his mother, which Xavier found both familiar and completely wonderful. He was not an uncomplicated baby. Babies seldom are. Lena managed the early months with the practical efficiency she brought to everything, and Xavier, who had not spent significant time around infants in his 12 years of ranging, discovered that he was rather better at it than he had expected, and rather more devoted to the pursuit than he would have predicted. He walked Thomas in the mornings when the baby would not sleep, circling the house in the cool pre-dawn air, and he found the repetitive motion meditative in a way that suited him. Cora Henderson at the bakery proved to be indispensable during the months when Lena was restricted, and in the months after Thomas arrived. keeping the business running with the confidence of someone who had absorbed everything Lena had taught her and was beginning to develop her own ideas about it. Lena returned to the bakery when Thomas was 4 months old, bringing the baby with her in a basket behind the counter, which the customers of Redemption received with general delight. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore came by the counter every other day and held Thomas with the comfortable ease of a woman who had raised children and knew what to do with babies, and she and Thomas regarded each other with mutual satisfaction while Lena worked. Mrs. Whitmore had become, over the course of the previous 2 years, something adjacent to family, a presence in their lives that was warm and practical and necessary in the way that good people become necessary. Life in Redemption had a texture to it that Xavier had not experienced in 12 years of ranging. There was routine and there was predictability, and there was the specific pleasure of being known in a place, of walking down the main street and being recognized, of Thomas being passed from arms to arms by people who knew his name, of coming home to the house with the blue door to find Lena at the kitchen table going over the bakery accounts in the lamplight. One evening he sat across from her at the kitchen table while she worked, and he watched her for a while, and she looked up and caught him watching, and she said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You have a very particular expression," she said. "You wear it sometimes when you think I'm not looking." What kind of expression? She considered this. Like someone who has found something they lost and still occasionally needs to confirm it's there. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that's accurate." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I'm here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "You can stop checking." "I don't mind checking," he said. She smiled at him, that small, warm, honest smile that he had been trying. Since the morning he first walked into Roswell's bakery in Millwood Crossing, and she looked up from her ledger to deserve. In the spring of 1886, Thomas was 11 months old and pulling himself upright on every piece of furniture in the house, and Lena was showing him, with a gravity that Xavier found extremely charming, how to put objects into a basket and take them out again, as an early study in the principles of orderly operation. Thomas was enthusiastic about the basket, but not always accurate about the putting in part, and much of the lesson involved collecting objects from a wide radius and returning them to the starting point. Xavier crossed the room and lifted him up, and Thomas grabbed his collar with both fists and laughed. Lena, still kneeling on the floor surrounded by the scattered objects of the basket lesson, looked up at both of them. "He walked," she said. "He did," Xavier agreed. 2 steps." 2 steps, he confirmed. She stood up, and there was something in her eyes that she didn't try to control, and she came and put her arms around both of them, the baby laughing between them. And it was such a simple and ordinary and extraordinary moment that Xavier had to hold it carefully in his mind, the way you hold something fragile, to make sure he was not letting it pass without fully recognizing what it was. The trial proceedings surrounding Pharaoh's case generated, through 1884 and 1885, a number of newspaper stories in the Austin and San Antonio papers, some of which touched on the circumstances of how the key evidence had been found and preserved. Lena's name appeared in several of these stories, correctly. Lena Roswell Crane now, though the reporters writing about the original events referred to her as Lena Roswell. Xavier read one of these stories carefully, and then set it down and thought about how it felt to see her name in print alongside the word courage, which several of the reporters used, which was the correct word. She read the same stories with a slight discomfort that he understood. She did not like being discussed, did not like the public aspect of it, felt that the things she had done in that alley in Millwood Crossing with the bakery burning had been necessity rather than courage, and that the gap between those two things was important. But she accepted the coverage with the same practical composure she brought to everything, and she answered the one letter a reporter sent directly to her with a brief, clear response that neither embellished nor diminished, and that the reporter, when he received it, found so well phrased that he quoted from it extensively. Millwood Crossing, for its part, received the news of Lena Roswell's survival with a range of reactions that Xavier heard about secondhand. Harold Fitch, who had been carrying considerable guilt for years, partly about the investment scheme and partly about having failed to do more after the fire, wrote her a letter that was long and emotionally overwhelming, and concluded with a standing offer of free goods from the general store, which was not something he could actually afford but which she found touching. She wrote him back a warm, forgiving letter and did not take him up on the goods. The doctor who had helped her, a man named Elias Drummond, received a personal visit from Xavier in the summer of 1884. Xavier rode to Millwood Crossing specifically to shake the man's hand. He found Drummond in his office, older now but still working, still maintaining the doctor and dentist arrangement out of practical necessity, and he shook his hand and thanked him with a directness that left Drummond briefly unable to speak. She was very clear about the danger, Drummond said when he recovered. She was one of the clearest thinking people I have ever met in a crisis. I simply did what seemed necessary. You did considerably more than that, Xavier said. You gave her time to survive. He rode back to Redemption thinking about the particular chain of decisions and accidents that had brought them to where they were, Pharaoh dropping a document, Lena finding it, Drummond choosing to help, Lena choosing to become invisible, 2.5 years of separate grief. A Wednesday in October when he happened to pass through a town he had no particular reason to visit, and the moment she looked up from the counter and time stopped. He thought about how thin the margin was, how many points in that chain could have gone differently. He thought about this sometimes, not often, but sometimes. And when he did, he felt the same thing he always felt, which was a combination of gratitude and something like vertigo. In the winter of 1886, Lena discovered she was pregnant again. She told him in the same manner she had told him the first time, calmly and over dinner, as if she were reporting a finding that he might find relevant. He kissed her with the same thoroughness as the first time, and dinner was again cold before they remembered it. This pregnancy was slightly harder than the first. She was more tired, and the bakery required management because she could not do everything herself. But Cora Henderson had by now developed into someone who could run the place reliably on days when Lena needed to rest, which Lena found both useful and slightly humbling, since she was not naturally a person who rested when things needed doing. Xavier had learned, over the years, not to try to make Lena rest when she was determined not to. He had learned instead to redistribute the things that needed doing so that the things that she was responsible for did not require her to be on her feet from 4 in the morning. And he arranged these redistributions with as little fanfare as possible, because she was also not a person who appreciated being managed, even kindly. He was good at the management without appearing to manage, which was a skill he had developed gradually and with some early missteps. The baby arrived in July of 1887. She was a girl. They named her Martha, for Lena's mother, which seemed right and necessary. Martha was quieter than Thomas had been as an infant, and regarded the world with a considering expression that Xavier recognized immediately. And he told Lena that the baby already looked as if she was deciding something. Lena looked at her daughter and said, "She probably is." Thomas, who was 2 years old and had developed a comprehensive and confident theory of how his household operated, inspected his new sister with the careful thoroughness of someone deciding whether a new arrangement was acceptable. After a significant period of examination, he declared her small, which was accurate, and then went back to the basket he had been working with, which by this point he was using with great precision, and as part of an elaborate organizational system for his collection of wooden animals. Life organized itself around them. Thomas grew into a sturdy, opinionated small person who was fascinated by horses and by the wildlife that could be seen along the creek north of town, and who had his mother's directness and his father's systematic way of approaching problems, which was a combination that suggested he would either become very effective at whatever he chose to do or occasionally insufferable, possibly both. Martha grew more slowly in personality, taking her time, watching everything, and by the time she was a year old it was clear that she had a sweetness to her that was genuine and not manufactured, a deep pleasure in other people that expressed itself in a willingness to sit with anyone who needed sitting with. Xavier's work continued to develop the district office into something more functional and responsive than it had been when he took over, and he managed to recruit 2 young rangers of real quality, a man named Jonas Hale, and a woman who worked as a civilian liaison, Clara Voss, who was extraordinarily good at extracting reliable information from communities that had learned to distrust official authority, which was most of them. He was not trying to build a legacy. He was simply trying to do the work well, which was the same thing he had always tried to do, and it turned out that doing it well in one place consistently over years was more effective than doing it well intermittently across the whole territory. Lena's bakery grew. She paid Oscar and Cora both fairly, which required thought and calculation but which she considered non-negotiable, partly because she believed in it and partly because she had spent 2.5 years being a person for whom money was a matter of survival, and she would not forget what that felt like. She called the bakery Roswell's because she was her mother's daughter and she saw no reason to give a business a name other than the person running it. Mrs. Whitmore declared the sign beautiful and bought 4 loaves to celebrate the opening, which was perhaps more bread than she needed but an unambiguous statement of support. One evening in the fall of 1888, after Thomas was in bed and Martha was sleeping in the next room and Lena was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, Xavier came out and sat beside her in the cool evening air, and they were quiet together for a while in the way that people who have been married for 5 years and are genuinely comfortable with each other can be quiet. "I thought about something today," Lena said. "What?" "The morning of the fire," she said, "standing in the alley. I've been thinking about it differently lately." He looked at her. "How so?" "For a long time I thought of it as the worst moment of my life," she said, "which it was. But I've been thinking lately that it was also. It was the moment when I had to decide who I was going to be, whether I was going to disappear completely or just mostly, whether I was going to keep the document or let it burn, whether I was going to stay alive." She paused. "I chose to stay alive and to keep the document, and those turned out to be the choices that led to everything else, including this." She gestured at the house, the street, the visible edges of their life. "I'm glad you chose to stay alive," he said. "I thought about you," she said. "When I was making the decision, in the alley, I thought if I disappear, there is a chance that I will find my way back to him eventually. If I do not stay alive, there is no chance of anything." He was quiet for a moment. The evening sounds of the town moved around them. Voices further down the street, a horse somewhere, the very faint sound of someone playing a fiddle at the Redemption Saloon, which had better music than most. "I'm glad that was part of the calculation," he said. She leaned against him, which she did sometimes in the evenings, shoulder against shoulder, her head tilted toward his. He put his arm around her. You ever think about what would have happened if you had taken a different road into town? She asked. If you had come in from the west instead of the east and never passed the corner where my stall was, he thought about this honestly. Yes, he said, sometimes. And it makes me want to thank every unremarkable circumstance that put me on the right road, he said. The particular assignment that sent me in this direction, the particular scheduling decision at the district office, the fact that I stopped for the night here instead of the next town. Small things, she said, very small things, leading to large things. Yes. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, I saw you coming down the street, before you saw me, just for a second, and I thought I was imagining it because I had imagined it before. I used to imagine seeing you in crowds in streets, and it was never you. And then I realized it was actually you, and my first feeling before the fear, before the panic, my first feeling was that I had never been so glad to see anyone in my life. He looked down at her. And then the fear. And then the fear, she agreed. Because I had been hiding for so long, and because I knew what it would mean for you to find me, what it would force into the open, what I would have to explain. You could have run, he said. When I was still across the street, you could have gone out the back. I know, she said. I thought about it. She paused. I couldn't. Because it was you, she said simply. I couldn't run from you. He held her more tightly, and she settled against him in the October evening in Redemption, Texas. And the fiddle from the saloon played something that might have been a waltz if the fiddler had been slightly more rigorous. And the stars over the flat western landscape were enormous and very clear. In 1889, Thomas started school. He approached this development with his characteristic systematic confidence, and within 2 weeks had a comprehensive opinion about the quality of the teaching high, the recess schedule insufficient, and the relative mathematical abilities of his classmates variable. His teacher, a young man named Professor Dale Simmons, who had come west from Ohio with genuine educational ideals and had applied them to Redemption schoolroom for 3 years, wrote a note home after the first month saying that Thomas was one of the most intellectually engaged students he had taught, and also suggesting, very diplomatically, that Thomas might benefit from learning to let other students answer questions before he did. Xavier read this note and looked at Lena, and she looked at him, and neither of them could argue with it. Martha, at 2, had become the most popular small person in Redemption almost without effort. She had a gift for walking up to adults and regarding them with such genuine, uncomplicated interest that they were immediately disarmed. And she and Mrs. Whitmore had developed a particular friendship that involved Mrs. Whitmore reading to Martha on Tuesday afternoons, which they both clearly considered one of the week's primary events. Xavier had been in Redemption for 7 years by 1889. 7 years of waking up in the same house, of walking the same streets, of being known. He had not expected, when he left Virginia as a young man with an uncertain future and a disposition toward movement, to find this particular life in this particular place. He had not known he was looking for it, and for a long time he had not been, and then he had been without knowing it, and then he had lost it and continued riding because there was nothing else to do, and then it had been returned to him in the most improbable fashion possible, and he had held on to it with both hands. He was not a sentimental man, particularly. He did not make speeches about what his life meant to him. But he felt it, the way you feel something that is genuinely yours, not with fanfare but with a deep, underlying certainty that this was the right configuration of the world. One morning, in November of 1889, he came down to the kitchen at 5 o'clock and found Lena already at the table with coffee and the bakery accounts, preparing for the day. Thomas was still asleep, Martha was still asleep. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the coffee was hot, and the lamp made the room golden. He poured himself a cup and sat across from her, and she looked up from the accounts and smiled at him, the full smile now, not just the small one. And he thought about standing in the middle of Redemption's Main Street on a Wednesday in October of 1882, with his horse stamping beneath him and a dead woman selling bread 20 feet away, and about all the ways that moment had been the pivot on which everything turned. "You're doing it again," she said. "What? The expression, the one where you're confirming I'm still here." "Am I?" "Yes." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm still here." "I know," he said. "You can really stop checking." "I don't mind checking," he said. She shook her head at him with a warmth that had been building for 7 years and had not diminished in any direction. In the spring of 1890, Lena discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time, and she told him in the same calm, reporting a finding manner as the previous 2 times, and he kissed her with the same thoroughness, and the dinner was once again cold, and they were once again entirely untroubled by this. The baby arrived in the winter of 1890, a second boy. They named him James, which was Lena's brother Daniel's middle name. Daniel was in Austin now, practicing law, and had come to visit 3 times over the years, and was awkward with the children in a way that suggested genuine good intentions and a complete inexperience with small people. James was large and loud and had Xavier's gray eyes and Lena's dark hair and a personality that announced itself immediately and without reservation. Thomas, who was 5, received his new brother with the assessment that James was going to be loud, which was accurate. Martha, who was 3, immediately decided she was going to be responsible for him, and began positioning herself near him with a protective attentiveness that would have been amusing except that it was also clearly genuine. The house with the blue door was becoming crowded in the specific, warm, complicated way of houses where children are growing. Xavier talked to Lena about adding a room at the back, and she looked at the house and at the family that had accumulated in and around it and said yes. Add 2 rooms, because one would not be enough for long. He arranged for a carpenter, a man named Samuel Park who had been building things in Redemption for 15 years, and Samuel Park spent a month adding 2 rooms at the back of the house with care and precision. And when he was finished, the house was considerably larger, and the blue door still marked its front. Xavier's captain retired in 1891, and the district underwent a reorganization, and Xavier was offered a position as a senior district officer that would have required moving to San Antonio. He considered this for a week, which was longer than he needed, because the answer was clear almost immediately. He declined, and negotiated instead for a formal charter for the Redemption District Office as an independent operation, which gave him the authority he needed to run it properly, without requiring him to leave the town where his children went to school, and where his wife's bakery fed half the population, and where he had lived long enough to be a real part of the place. He wrote the captain a letter explaining this decision. The captain wrote back saying that he understood, and that Crane was the best judge of his own situation, and that it had been a privilege to work with him for 23 years, and that he was going to go fishing. In 1893, Thomas was 8 years old and had developed a serious interest in the natural world, particularly in the birds that came through the river grasslands in the spring migrations, and he kept a careful journal of what he saw. Martha was 6 and was reading at a level that Professor Simmons, who was still at the school and had grown into a genuinely excellent teacher, described in notes home as exceptional. James was 3 and was into everything, not in a chaotic way but in a systematic way that suggested he was doing research, and the house required more vigilance than it had previously. Lena's bakery, Roswell's, had by 1893 become the kind of institution that towns grow around. The place everyone knew, the anchor of the main street, a business whose absence would have genuinely changed the character of the place. Cora Henderson had become a full partner in practical terms, though not yet in formal ones, and Lena was thinking about how to formalize this because it was the right thing to do and because Cora had earned it. Oscar Graves had left the previous year to open his own bakery in a town 2 days' ride north, which Lena had encouraged with complete sincerity and a good reference, and she had replaced him with a young woman named Bessie Grant, who was learning quickly, and who had an inventiveness about flavors that Lena found both inspiring and occasionally alarming. One afternoon in October of 1893, exactly 11 years after Xavier had frozen in the middle of Redemption's Main Street, he was walking home from the district office, and he passed the corner where Lena's stall had been. The stall was gone now, had been gone for years, replaced by the proper bakery down the street, but the corner was still there, and he sometimes noted it in passing the way you note places where significant things happened. He stopped there for a moment. It was the same time of day, late afternoon, the same autumn light. The street was different now, Redemption having grown considerably in 11 years, more people and more buildings and a regular stage connection in both directions. But the quality of the light was the same, and he stood in it and thought for a moment about the man who had ridden down this street in 1882, with nothing in particular ahead of him, except another assignment, another town, another stretch of solitary road. He thought about that man with something like compassion and something like gratitude. Compassion because the man had been genuinely alone and had been trying, not very successfully, to make peace with being alone. Gratitude because the man had not turned around when he should have turned around, had not ridden away when his whole history of riding away suggested he would, had walked toward the woman behind the counter instead. He walked home. He came in through the blue door. James was in the kitchen making an authoritative mess with some wooden blocks and several books that had been repurposed as architectural elements. Martha was at the table with her reading. Thomas was not yet home from school. Lena was at the stove, her back to him. She was stirring something and talking to James about whatever James had been asking about before Xavier came in, which sounded like a detailed inquiry into whether horses understood mathematics. She looked over her shoulder when she heard him come in. "Close the door properly," she said. James worked out how to open it. He closed the door properly and looked at her, at the back of her dark head and the shore, easy movements at the stove and the life that was moving all around her, children and books and the smell of whatever she was cooking, and the particular quality of light in the kitchen in the late afternoon. He crossed the room and kissed her on the side of her head, and she leaned briefly back against him with the ease of 11 years of practice, and then straightened and went back to stirring. "Thomas will be home in 20 minutes, she said. "Dinner in 30. "All right," he said. James looked up from his construction project and said, very seriously, "Papa, do horses know numbers?" Xavier sat down on the kitchen floor next to his son and the architectural arrangement, and thought about this with appropriate gravity. "I think," he said, "that horses are very intelligent, but that their intelligence runs more toward understanding distance and direction, and the reliability of their riders." James considered this. "So they know how far but not how many," something like that. "Interesting," James said, and went back to the blocks. Lena, at the stove, made a sound that was trying to be a laugh and not quite succeeding. Xavier looked at her and she looked back at him over her shoulder, and the laugh broke through. The real one. The the same one he had heard from across a street 11 years ago, when he did not yet know what it would mean to him. Outside, redemption, Texas went on being what it was in the autumn of 1893, a real place, a working place, with all the ordinary weight and motion of real life moving through it. The cotton farms along the river were in their late-season work. The stage came through twice a week. The school and the church and the saloon each did their separate business. The district office was quiet today, and would not be tomorrow, and the territory went on being what it was, vast and demanding and full of the particular justice and injustice of the frontier, where things were being worked out slowly and not always fairly and not always well, but being worked out nevertheless, in the slow grind of courts and land records and the gradual accumulation of people choosing, day by day, what kind of place they were going to make. And in a kitchen on the north side of town, in a house with a blue door, a former ranger who had once believed the best years of his life had been lost forever sat on the floor with his youngest son and discussed equine mathematics, while his daughter read at the table, and his wife made dinner, and the world arranged itself around all of them into something that felt very much, very specifically, and very completely like home. Thomas came in 22 minutes later, as predicted, with his bird journal under his arm and a report about 2 species he had seen at the creek that morning that he had not recorded before. He ate dinner with the focused enthusiasm of a person who has had an important day and wants everyone to understand this, and Martha asked careful, intelligent questions about the birds that encouraged him considerably. And James ate with efficient concentration, because he had decided that food was primarily fuel, and one should not complicate the process. After dinner, Xavier and Lena sat on the porch while the children had the last hour of the evening inside, and the sky over the flat Texas land was enormous and full of stars, and the air was the cool, dry air of October that reminded him, as it always did, of a particular afternoon 11 years ago. "I was thinking earlier," he said, "about the day I rode in." She looked at him. She knew which day he meant. They both always knew which day he meant when he said it that way. "What about it?" she asked. "About what would have happened if I had taken a different road," he said. "If I had never come down that particular street at that particular time." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I used to think about that too," she said. "In the early months here, I used to think he will never find me. I am hidden too well, I have been too careful." She paused. "And then I thought, but if he does find me somehow against all probability, then perhaps the universe is less indifferent than I have been assuming. And when I did find you," she looked at him. "I thought, there it is," she said. "There is the answer to that question." He looked at her for a long time in the starlight. He had been assigned to ride through redemption on his way to somewhere else. He had been riding through places on his way to somewhere else for 12 years. He had never meant to stop. He had simply stopped, because a horse will sometimes stop when a rider is not paying quite enough attention, and when he looked up from whatever he had been thinking about, she was there. He took her hand. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The stars over Texas were very old and very bright and very far away, and below them the small facts of the present moment. A house with a blue door, 3 children inside moving toward sleep, a woman with steady hands and dark eyes and a life she had rebuilt from a burning alley, and a hidden document, and 2.5 years of extraordinary difficulty, were as real and as solid and as permanent as anything that had ever been real and solid and permanent. He was here, she was here, they were not going anywhere. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.